I'm happy to be here virtually at Shantideva once again.
Thank you.
We could just for a moment establish our motivations for listening to the Dharma this evening. I mean, I'm listening to the Dharma as I'm talking and as I hear your questions. And I think, my motivation is to try to get these things as clear as possible in my mind, as deeply as possible into my subconscious as well as my conscious mind, so that I can gain a more realistic view of reality, which will enable me to be more effective in my attempts to be kind toward other people. That's how I understand the practice of the path. So I'm going to run, I have a PowerPoint, and who knows, my idea is to run it for about an hour and talk over the slides as I go. And then that will leave plenty of time for questions, I hope. So I'll just sort of explain what I'm going to do with this series of talks in the PowerPoint here. Yeah, Buddhism and the meaning of life. So this is the idea for this course comes from, I've been teaching Buddhism at Central Michigan University in Mount Pleasant, Michigan for 35 years. I've taught, Buddhism almost every year, and most years more than once. And I also have online versions of the course now that I teach through the university. And a lot of that time, I've also been in a department chairperson and so forth, and sort of administrative roles. So it gave me release time from teaching, so I wasn't teaching full time. And being done with that phase of my life in 2019, I was thinking, well, now I'm going to be teaching full time. I need to have some other course to teach because there aren't enough students interested in Buddhism to fill up a full teaching load for me. And I really didn't want to go back to teaching world religions. So I, got the idea of teaching a course called The Meaning of Life at the 100 level. Trying to use a way to provide these 18 and 19-year-olds living away from home for the first time with information that, it's basically like a buffet table of possibly ways of making sense out of the world, rather than just going by what their parents or their peers or their churches or synagogues have told them. Here are some alternative ways that people have made sense around the world. And I like teaching this course. It's a lot of, I get a lot of enjoyment out of it because with the idea of trying to find things that will be helpful to the students, I can do anything I want. That is, I don't have to talk about religion. I don't have to talk about Buddhism if that doesn't seem to be clicking with them. I can talk about Stoicism, or I can talk about the Serenity Prayer. I can talk about Bhakti Yoga. I can talk about existentialism. It's really, I talk about, all kinds of psychological theories and philosophies, as well as religion, and just in whatever combination seems to be working best for them. And so Buddhism is not a particular focus in the course, but it's clear to me as I teach the course that the things that I'm teaching them all are also taught in Buddhism, perhaps. And Buddhism perhaps may teach other things beyond the things that are in the course. But there's like very strong resonances between many of the ideas in the course and many ideas in Buddhism. I just teaching them in the Meaning of Life course in a way that's sort of separate from Buddhism. So usually with a couple exceptions. So I thought it would be interesting to try to put these things together. My experience as a teacher of Buddhism, as well as a scholar of Buddhism, but with what I'm actually teaching a lot of these days, and that is this meaning of life class. So here's the overweek of it. There's a 4-week series. You may know. It's this week and next week, and then we take a week off, and then it's the next 2 Mondays after that. So I've outlined it roughly like this. Tonight is what we call practical approaches. Next time, effective care, the third class, which will be in July, One Bright Pearl, and the fourth one, Nothing Left to Lose. So what this is basically talking about kind of pragmatic approach to dealing with problems or questions about what we know and what's real and how to approach difficulties that we come up against or that the people around us come up against in life. And then the next 3 are, in a very rough way, organized around the idea of the 3 trainings: training in ethics, training in meditation, and training in wisdom. So next week, in other words, we'll be focusing on kindness, and then the week after we'll be talking about meditative absorption, and some related things that aren't necessarily go a little beyond that. And then last week we'll be focusing more on ideas about that are related to emptiness, but as they may appear in traditions other than Buddhism specifically. So this is the idea, is to sort of look at some philosophical ideas that come from different traditions around the world, but that have either have parallels in Buddhism or or to look at Buddhist texts and see how other traditions have parallels to their ideas. That's the general idea. And so this evening's class, which I call Practical Approaches, has 2 sections. So I was trying to figure out how to organize this, and there were 2 possible ideas in my mind. One is to go through 3 trainings, for example, and then as I come to each topic, sort of relate it to things that are not just in Buddhism, but are beyond Buddhism, where you see other cultures doing something very similar. And the other approach is to look at the main textbook that I use in my Meaning of Life class, which is called The Power of Meaning. And that book outlines 4 pillars of meaning, the human construction of the architecture of meaning built around 4 pillars. And to go through each of those pillars and say what it is the textbook author says about it, and then give examples of how that works within the Buddhist tradition. So by and large, I've decided to go with the first of those methods, that is to focus primarily on outlining Buddhism and then looking at parallels in other traditions to some of the ideas. But the first part of the class this evening, I'm going to talk about, use the other approach initially, right? So tonight's class basically has 2 parts. One where I'm going to go through the 4 pillars of meaning and show a couple examples of how they pop up in Buddhism, and then begin looking at what is the core metaphor in the Buddhist tradition, right? And how does that metaphor guide our approach to problems in life? And that will set up the next 3 classes. Okay, so the 4 pillars of meaning. This is Emily Esfahani Smith. She has a book called The Power of Meaning. She comes from a Canadian Sufi family, actually. I believe she's still in graduate school, but she had a lot of success with this book. It really works well for my students who, I guess, average 19 years old. I mean, the idea that there are 4 particular pillars of meaning is very artificial. It's like I remember the Dalai Lama one time talking about there's different kinds of lists, and some of them are definitive because they're part of the structure of reality, and some of them are instructive and artificial. So I think he gave the example of, say, the two truths, conventional truth and ultimate truth. This is a definitive list, right? There's not like, yeah, we can make 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 truths. No, it's just like, well, how things exist conventionally and what they are ultimately, that's 2. On the other hand, he gave the example of the 6 perfections as like, well, there's all different kinds of things. There's also lists of 10 perfections in Buddhism as well. And therefore, this is like, there's not a definitive list of the kinds of virtues the Bodhisattva is cultivating, but it's nonetheless useful to have these categories just for instructional purposes, right? And that's how I think of these 4 pillars of meaning. I don't build the whole class around it, but yeah, it's a foundation, I guess you could say. Yeah, her work is all based on social science, mostly psychological studies, but it also includes a lot of vivid, true personal stories that she gathered. That's really what she writes these stories very clearly, and the students can relate to and understand the ideas through these personal narratives. So the general approach of the book is like this. That people talk about happiness all the time, and this happiness can mean a whole bunch of different kinds of things. Well, I see. But maybe life really, maybe we should be thinking about meaning instead of happiness. This is, it's not really a matter of what kind of mood we're in, as whether we find a sense of fulfillment or satisfaction based in life. I mean, you can understand Aristotle's idea of eudaimonia as a meaningful life as well as a happy life, right? It's a full flourishing of our lives, means having a kind of meaningful existence. So perhaps you could say that life doesn't have any objective built-in meaning. I would say that that's her general point of view, and that human beings around the world are diverse, they're complex, we're all constantly changing, and we have many different points of view in terms of how we look at what life is and what its meaning could be. And then each of these viewpoints has its specific cultural, political, historical context, or in cases, you break it down further, individual psychological history, right? And each of these viewpoints, which could be contradictory to one another, can rest on a distinct set of unprovable basic starting points or axioms or assumptions, that come out of the history of the culture or the life history of the particular individual. And that, so I tell the students at the beginning of the class, this class will not teach you the meaning of life, right? Because no one has an absolute God's eye view. None of us have all the answers. And it's really here are a lot of things that you could think about and try to work out for yourself what kind of meaning you want to see in your life. That's the general, I guess, approach of the book at an explicit level. But I think at an implicit level, she definitely has the idea that human life is meaningful and is made meaningful in certain kinds of ways, right? And she calls those the 4 pillars of meaning, as I mentioned before. 4 ways to find, to find means as though it's already there and you uncover it, or to construct in the sense of say, well, life isn't inherently meaningful, but we make it meaningful in certain kinds of ways, right? And the first of these is belonging, is most fundamental. We're social mammals. We need to have a sense of connection, a sense of purpose, dedicating ourselves to a cause that goes beyond ourselves, to helping or saving others, storytelling. So telling useful stories that are drawn from the raw material of all these uncountable micro moments of experience that go rushing by every day. We tell a story about what we did during the day, which leaves out most of the things that we actually experiences, but just picks a few and strings them together. And that's what we've always been doing, create a sense of meaning for ourselves and for one another. And then also transcendence, which for my purposes here, I'm going to say means having an experience where the self that is threatened by death is seen to be a delusion in the first place. And therefore you transcend any sense of that we're threatened by death by realizing that the self that we think would be destroyed when we die has never really existed at all. And that you realize it not through thinking philosophically, but in transcendence, it's a matter of having an experience of knowing this. Okay. So those are her 4 pillars of meaning. And she goes through the book and gives examples from many different examples of each one. Buddhism does pop up once or twice, but it's not at all the focus. So I just thought I'd look at each of these briefly and see very briefly what she says about them and how they might relate to a Buddhist context. I think she starts with belonging because she sees it as the most inevitable, the most critical to our sense of well-being, happiness, or our own sense of meaning, is that we need to have a sense of connection with other human beings. And so then she brings in various social science research that suggests that a sense of belonging, comes either from close relationships within a community or certain you could say high quality interactions, or like intimate moments of intimate connection. And moments of intimate connection don't have to be with somebody who's part of your community. It can even be with strangers, or it can be with people you only see once, but exchange a moment of recognition of one another as fellow human beings, right? On the other hand, we could be in community and be rather poverty-stricken in terms of high-quality interactions within the community. So I think what these two have in common is this idea of focusing on others or opening our hearts to them, to see each other in a human-to-human way, to recognize others as just like us, rather than being objects that we can get, or as obstacles to our getting what we want, or as tools or instruments that we can use to get what we want. Instead, seeing them as other subjects, other fellow human beings who are just as real as us and have the same kinds of problems in general terms that we have. And so at the end of this chapter, she said, basically, she starts with belonging as the first pillar, because I think she feels it like it's the most indispensable. That is, people can do fine without a sense of transcendence in their lives. But you really have to have some kind of sense of connection with other human beings. And these are paraphrases of Emily Smith's end of her chapter on belonging. Meaning isn't something we create within or for ourselves through a solitary quest, philosophical or otherwise. Meaning largely lies in others, that we create it by reaching out, making connections with others, focusing beyond ourselves. Okay, so this is like the general first pillar. And so I just thought I would make, I'm going to connect each of these 4 to some examples from Buddhism. So this is a famous sutta in which, and this from the Samyutta Nikaya, where Ananda says to the Buddha, "Venerable Sir, this is half of the holy life. That is good friendship, good companionship, good comradeship." And the Buddha says, "Not so, Ananda, not so. This is the entire holy life. That is good friendship, good companionship, good comradeship." Interesting. And then the sutta goes on a little, it's not long, but it goes on a little bit. And in which Buddha goes on to explain that he means that good comradeship, good companionship, good friendship is the whole of a Dharma life, because when you have a good friend, a good companion, a good comrade, you will cultivate and develop the Noble Eightfold Path. So essentially, that's what a good friend means, is somebody who is, with whom you make a connection that is conducive to your practicing the Dharma. And then purpose. This is the definition she gives of purpose. It's based on a social science research. A stable, far-reaching goal, a goal towards which we're always working, an organizing principle of our lives. In other words, not your short-term objectives. And also, some of the authors she quotes suggest that a purpose should involve some kind of contribution to the world, making some kind of difference by contributing to something larger than yourself. And so, after giving a whole bunch of examples, she reaches conclusions. She has this, supposedly John F. Kennedy visited NASA and asked a janitor what he was doing. And the janitor said, "I'm helping to put a man on the moon." Yeah, it's a great story. I wonder if it really happened like that. And so then a quote from her text: "No matter what occupies our days, when we frame our tasks as opportunities to help others, our lives and our work feel more significant." Yeah, they are more significant. It reminds me of something that, I've heard teachers say, that is, they're all the time we're doing ordinary things, ordinary tasks. And we can do a practice of connecting these things to a bodhisattva motivation. I'm going to drink some water, and I'm going to drink this water, so that I will be better able to save all my mothers from cyclic existence. Whatever we do, Jeffrey Hopkins, my teacher in grad school, he would talk about, I'm going to go over here and open this door by turning this doorknob for the sake of all sentient beings, and so forth. So, yeah, that's a Buddhist way of looking at this idea. Akira Kurosawa has this movie Ikiru, in which there's a man dying of cancer who can't figure out the meaning of life, and he goes through various attempts as he's getting sicker, and he meets this young woman who seems very happy, even though she's a line worker in a factory. And he finally asks her why she can be so happy when she has such drudgery as a job. And she says, "Well, it's a factory, but it's a toy factory. And as I'm making each toy, I think about the joy that it will bring to the kids who eventually get to play with the toys." And so that, anyway, that's an example. And she ends by basically saying, we all have capacities to help some others in some ways, and thereby find a sense of purpose, and thereby have a sense of meaning in our lives. And yeah, we're differently abled in terms of what we can best do to help others. And I think, for the young people in my class, a lot of the work is trying to figure out what it is they might be able to do. They would like to make a difference and also make a living, but they haven't really figured out what talents and skills that they'll need in order to do that. I believe this, and I believed it for a long time. And I think basically my mother taught me this attitude. But when my mother died a couple years ago, and when she was quite old, she gradually lost both physical capacity and gradually lost mental capacity. And then she became depressed because she felt that there was no longer anything that she could really do to be helpful to other people. And therefore her life really had no meaning or purpose. And this was a riddle for me, because I tried to make various suggestions, and really they were all unworkable. There wasn't anything that she could really do. And so finally I told her that her purpose was to provide other people an opportunity to practice being more caring, and that was a really important service to the world. I'm not sure whether she really bought it or not, but I convinced myself that that's true. We have to be really good at receiving gifts of care from other people, and seeing ourselves sometimes as being able to generously receive help from others, right? So of course, this, idea of purpose corresponds in Buddhism most specifically to the dedication of the Bodhisattva. And some lines from Shantideva's Bodhisattva Charyavatara: for the benefit of all beings, I will bring forth, it's supposed to say forth, the awakened mind. Those with clearer minds should lift their hearts with praises such as these. Today, my life has given fruit, and I have fulfilled my potential in this human birth. So I picked that part of the, the Bodhisattva dedication lines from Shantideva because of this quote at the end, where he said, this is like the whole point of being born as a human, right? I haven't wasted my human life because I have reached this point of having a wholehearted dedication to serving others over however, as long as space remains. And you see similar things, that is of course from the Indian Mahayana tradition. You see many different versions of these kinds of vows in different sutras. You can look it up if you want. There isn't one set of Bodhisattva vows. There are many different versions of the Bodhisattva vows. And one of the ones that we hear the most, because of the prominence, I think, of Zen Buddhism in the United States, is called the Four Extensive Vows. But they aren't specific to Zen. They actually seem to have been developed in Tian Tai, Chinese Buddhism. Sentient beings, limitless in number, I vow to ferry over. Passions, or afflictions are numberless, I vow to extinguish. The Dharma gates without end, I vow to know. In the supreme Buddha way, I vow to actualize. So I think it was pointed out by Zhi, who formulated this originally. It seems that the four correspond to the Four Noble Truths, in the sense that, the first one focuses on suffering, the causes of suffering, and then the objects through realization of which one attains liberation, and then following the path of the Buddha. And then this is a quote I really like from His Holiness the Dalai Lama. When you practice with a sense of dedication to the well-being of others, then you feel yourself fulfilled. You yourself feel fulfilled. This is the purpose of our life. What's the point of having a luxurious way of life and spending lots of money while on the same planet others are facing terrible difficulties, even starving? Helping others, serving others. This is the real meaning of life. If you believe that God created us as social beings, then there must be some deep meaning in this. As social beings, the very basis of our life is taking care of each other, showing concern, helping one another. Right? And then the third pillar of meaning is storytelling. I like this quote from Gabriel Garcia Marquez. This is my translation. Life is not what you lived, but rather what you remember and how you remember it so as to tell the story. So stories are the way human beings create meaning. Like we think a lot in terms of, what are the tenets or what is the philosophy, that Buddhism teaches, right? But my observation, teaching different religions for my career, is that religions aren't really philosophies at core, right? They're ways of life, and these ways of life are organized around narratives and stories and metaphors that are embedded in these stories. And these stories are like fountains of meaning, and in different generations, in different places, different people drawing from the same stories, draw different kinds of meanings and formulate them into different philosophies, and then argue about whose philosophy, based on which interpretation of the story, is better than the other one. But they're all rooted in the same story, right? The story of Adam and Eve, or for Christians, the story of Jesus's life. And for Buddhists, it's, the traditional story of Buddha's life serves a similar function. And so stories help, when we tell a story about our own life, it gives us a stable sense of self in a psychological sense. And at the same time, the stories that we hear, are ways of transmitting specific cultural values, right? People remember morals, right? Lessons when they're embedded in narratives. So I think that the root story, of course, Buddhism has many stories, but the root story is the story of the life of Siddhartha. And I just thought this is not, we have other things to do, but I just thought I would quickly go through some of the things that, we talk about as practices or lessons in Buddhism, but are taught in this story. This is just some of them, right? So giving up false refuge, the idea of the young Siddhartha who has all the possible luxuries in life, and yet doesn't find a sense of peace or satisfaction, and then formulates a determination to be free, right? A wish to get out of cyclic existence. And then through, the story, it's like, well, the extremes of self-indulgence didn't provide satisfaction, nor did the extremes of asceticism, the self-starvation, didn't bring satisfaction either. So the middle way in terms of a lifestyle is clearly spelled out in the story. And then concentration meditation, the way that when Buddha leaves home, he first learns how to have these very, very deep states of concentration. And this equips him. This prepares him he has the meditative skills to penetrate reality later. But through mastering these types of deep concentration meditation, he doesn't find the peace or satisfaction that he's looking for. So this idea that concentration meditation is very important and yet is not the answer. It's a tool that we use, right, to try to penetrate the nature of reality. That's embedded in the story. And then, of course, the idea of awakening, realizing the nature of dependent arising. And then the Buddha's career as a teacher is full of examples of skillful means, where he teaches some people in one way and other audiences in different ways. Of course, the relationship between the monastic Sangha and the rest of the society, right, comes out. And then finally, and in the Buddha's last days, this idea that we should rely upon the Dharma rather than particular people, right? To look to the teachings of the Buddha as a light to guide us. And then I'll just one slide basically on the fourth pillar. Transcendence has a lot of different meanings, and for Emily Smith, she tries to interpret it very broadly. But I'm particularly interested in transcendence in this sense of people having what we could call, roughly speaking, a mystical experience where they realize themselves as not being at all what they thought they were, and thereby overcoming their fear of death. And this is an example from Soko Morinaga's Novice to Master. So it's a Rinzai, 20th century Rinzai Zen memoir. In order to instantly apprehend situations that I faced as a teacher, I had to first pass through fear of death. My practice was so rigorous. I mean, he was sleeping very little, meditating almost all the time. My practice was so rigorous that a voice would whisper a warning to me: if you go on like this, you might die, and you better stop. And I did feel that if I kept going, I would die. But it didn't turn out that way. One night I sat in the middle of the night, a lump of fatigue on a zazen cushion, both body and consciousness in a haze. And I could not arouse desire for Satori if I wanted to, when suddenly the fog cleared and a world of lucidity opened itself. Clearly seeing, clearly hearing, but it was a world in which there was no more me, right? So this is his, first real awakening experience. And I think it perfectly illustrates, kind of Buddhist example from the 20th century of an experience of transcendence. And it does happen that Emily Smith has a Buddhist example in her Transcendence chapter, which is about a man who went to Burma to practice Buddhist meditation and attained a really deep sense of peace. Okay, so that is the first part of tonight's class. The second part is on the core metaphor. What is the core metaphor? That's the basis for structuring, the Buddhist story, right? And we have a number of competitors for core metaphor. There is the idea that of the word Buddha means the awakened one. So we're sleeping, and we're as though sleeping ones, we have yet to awaken. And so the things that appear to us are like dreams. We don't see things realistically as they are. This is very fundamental to the whole of Buddhism. You can't find any significant parts of Buddhism where this isn't part of the structure. And then the idea of the path. So we may not even think of it, but the path is itself a metaphor, right? It's not a literal path. It's like following in the footsteps, of a teacher who has gone before. And then the medical metaphor, which I'm going to argue at least is for the rest of tonight, is like the core metaphor that we want to focus on at least. That their Buddha is like a doctor, and the Dharma is like the medicine, and the Sangha is like the other healthcare professionals. So you can make sense out of a lot of things in Buddhism by thinking about how they work in terms of this metaphor. It's useful for me, and trying to get people who aren't familiar with Buddhism at all to understand that Buddhism is not just like you transcribe the monotheistic religion you're familiar with, but then substitute Buddha for God, and then it's something like that. Well, it really isn't something like that. And why is it not? Well, it's because they're, the core metaphor is built around therapy. It's built around the idea of spiritual therapy, a course of healing prescribed by a person who worked it out for himself 2,500 years ago. And so, the whole idea of being a Buddhist is taking refuge in the three jewels. And we take refuge in the three jewels, not because we want the Buddha as our personal savior, right? No, we take refuge in the Buddha as though in a doctor, right? And in his teachings as though in medicine, right? And so you can only make sense out of this basic practice of being a Buddhist, of taking refuge in terms of the medical metaphor. And also the Four Noble Truths. When you think about the order of the Four Noble Truths, it's very, when I first teach these to students, they always get the order confused. Not all of them, but they very often get the order confused initially because doesn't seem sequential to them. You start with suffering and then you go to the causes of suffering, which are obviously had to precede the effect of the suffering. And then you go to the true cessations. And then after that, you go to something else that had to take place before the true cessations. So it's not a chronological narrative. So what is the logic of the Four Noble Truths? It's the logic of, a doctor seeing a patient, seeing this is what your basic situation is. This is what, the diagnosis is to what the causes of your situation are. And good news, it can be cured, but in order to do that, you need to take this prescription. It's like the logical sequence is a sequence of a visit to the doctor. So, there are many well-known Buddhist texts, both in Mahayana and in Theravada, early Buddhism as well, that are very clear about this kind of attitude. One of them is very famous. It's just as if a man were wounded, Buddha is speaking, and he's explaining why he can't, isn't going to really answer all the speculative questions that his students have. It's as if a man were wounded with an arrow smeared with poison, and his friends could give him a surgeon, but the man might say, I'm not going to have the arrow out until I know whether the person who wounded me was, what caste that person was from, or until I know what the bowstring was made of. And then he goes on and on and on, what kind of bird the feathers came from and so forth that were on the back of the arrow. And then, punchline, the guy would die, and and those things would still remain unknown to him, right? So there's all kinds of things we can be curious about and spend our lives wondering about and working on, right? But the important thing is to focus on what is actually going to be of practical healing benefit, right? Obviously, this is a clear case of using the medical metaphor to say, what is it we're trying to do here? We're not trying to answer all the questions that we might have about the Big Bang, for example, but to figure out how we can live in a way that is healing to ourselves and others. And then another, you see that's from the shorter exhortation to Malonkya, which is in the Madhyamaka Nikaya. And then an even more famous passage, and this is kind of a summary of the sutta. Buddha goes to visit a certain village, and the people say, look, all kinds of gurus coming through here all the time, and they all teach different things, and how are we supposed to know what to believe? And the Buddha says, this is famous, don't accept things just because they're being repeated a lot, or they come from the tradition or the scriptures or the rumor or guesswork or incorrect reasoning or bias or clever ways of speaking, or out of mere respect for the teacher or speaker. Instead, when you know for yourself that something leads to harm and sorrow, is not welcomed by the wise, then abandon it. And then he goes on, so you can see that the presence of greed, hatred, and ignorance leads to people taking life, stealing, committing adultery, and telling lies, as well as encouraging others to do that. And all these activities lead to harm and sorrow. Whereas freedom from greed, hatred, and ignorance is achieved by the presence of love, compassion, joy, and equanimity. Then in that case, people do not take life, steal, commit adultery, or tell lies, and they do not encourage others to do that. And so you'll observe that this will lead to lasting benefit and happiness in such behavior, is praised by the wise. So that's a paraphrase or summary of the Kesamutti Sutta from the Anguttara Nikaya. This is a very famous passage where you can see in the Pali Canon, Buddha is teaching basically, let's see what works. See what works in your life. Does stealing all the time actually lead to a profound sense of satisfaction and harmony in your community, right? Or not? And then the most famous passage in the Mahayana text that's along the same lines, you probably also seen. Buddha says, yeah, only accept what is beneficial. It's basically the same standard that's outlined in the Kesamutti Sutta. Do not accept my words on faith or believe them just because I said them. Be like an analyst buying gold who cuts, burns, and critically examines his product for authenticity. Only accept what passes the test and by proving useful and beneficial in your life, right? So that's from the Gandhavyuha, Flower Array Sutra, Mahayana Sutra. And then I thought I would compare Buddhaghosa, who's probably the most important formulator of Theravada Buddhism, with Shantideva, who we're familiar with from the Mahayana tradition. And looking at these two and seeing, what kinds of things are they asking people, telling people to do as part of the practice of the path, it seems clear that they both give an overlapping array of meditative practices like medicines. They don't just say, okay, do this, and then do this other thing, and then do this other thing, and then you're done. No, they say like, well, you could consider this, and also, that might help. But on the other hand, you might also want to consider this, and then you might also want to consider this. It's a Dharma pharmacy. There's lots of different practices. If you can't cultivate loving compassion towards the Magga people, for example, the Buddhaghosa will give you 15 or 18 different kinds of techniques you can try. And it's not, there isn't like the magic answer to how to overcome, your resentment towards people, right? And so as to include them in the sphere of your care, right? There are many different techniques. There are many different medicines that are available. And Shantideva does the same thing. Some people have argued trying to figure out all the things Shantideva says and how they can be philosophically reconciled to each other. And probably the best answer is, it doesn't matter. That's not what he's interested in. He's not interested in being self-consistent. He's interested in giving you a buffet, like an array of different things that might be useful to you, right? Yeah, so here's something that might help. But if it doesn't work, try this other thing. And if that doesn't work, think about this, right? So, because, according to our situation, we all need different medicines to loosen up our grasping and challenge our delusions. And it could be that even in the course of our life, maybe even the course of a day, we need different medicines at different times, right? And as we obviously do in the literal pharmaceuticals, so it is with these spiritual pharmaceuticals too. There's not, you could say, well, doesn't the Dharma say that if you realize emptiness, then that is gets at the root of all these problems. And so you don't really need all these other medicines if you can realize the ultimate nature of reality. Okay, yeah, but that's not the way medicine actually works, right? Different people and that's not the way the Dharma works. Not everybody is actually helped by being taught the profound emptiness, right? And some people could actually be harmed psychologically and this is recognized within the tradition, right? So it's a matter of a skillful physician recognizing the situation of a particular patient and prescribing the appropriate medicine. So there can be many different right ways, by which we mean helpful ways to analyze things or situations, and each, according to circumstances, may aid in untangling the samsaric tangles in which we find ourselves. That metaphor of untangling tangles comes from the beginning of Buddhaghosa's Path of Purification, where he points out that in the course of 45 years of teaching, sometimes the Buddha taught a path to liberation that was based on the cultivation of virtue. And sometimes he taught a path of liberation that seems to be based on the practice of concentration meditation. And sometimes he taught a path to liberation that seemed to be based on wisdom, right? And then sometimes he taught a path to liberation that seemed to be based on integrating all these things, right? And so it's not like, he always told everybody the same answer. He was a real doctor. So he tells different people different things according to what they need to hear. So, right, in the West, we could think of this approach as like pragmatism. Pragmatism was, for example, the view of William James, the great American psychologist and philosopher, and also many others, even maybe before William James and since William James, have adopted a pragmatic philosophy. Pragmatism is a tradition that considers all our words and our thoughts as tools or instruments, making predictions, solving problems such as healing people, and taking actions. Our thoughts are not evaluated in terms of how well they correspond to or mirror some objective reality. Our thoughts and our statements are evaluated in terms of how helpful they are in getting something done, right? And that's, you can see that how this is like the view of the Buddha. We look at, So to say that something is true, pragmatism basically means that it's useful to believe that, right? And we don't have to, this takes us out of the business of figuring out how to go outside our viewpoint and go around the back to the object itself and see what it really is apart from how we see it. We can't ever do that. Nobody can, right? And so, right, what we have to do is think about, is this or that way of looking at things more or less helpful? And this is basically what Buddha was telling, the people in the Kesamuti Sutta. What helps is the big question. And here's what, here's something that the Dalai Lama said about it. I think of Buddhism as offering the world, he means offering the world, all y'all, one set of ideas that might be helpful. They can equip our minds, particularly our emotions, so that we can maintain peace of mind when facing difficulty. These ideas could be good for your health, mentally and physically. So even if you have no interest in religion, fine. If you hear something, it means in the Dharma. If you hear something that sounds useful, take it. And if you feel that it's nonsense, then just forget it. Reality is neither Buddhist nor Christian. Yeah, that's another quote from His Holiness that I think is, expressing this. Part of what it expresses is this same pragmatic idea. So I want to in this last part, talk about a little bit about this pragmatic approach and how it relates to the scientific method, and how how the scientific method kind of relates to a Buddhist way of thinking. The idea is that the scientific method is based on error, recognition of disproving hypotheses, and thereby improving our way of looking at things and doing things. And the basic problem is, if in Buddhist philosophy, we say that everything is empty of its own intrinsic nature, then how can we know anything? How can we do anything? How can there be any distinction between one thing and another? And as we'll talk about, later toward the end of this 4 weeks, Tsongkhapa and Chandrakirti, upon whom he relies, deny that there's any essential character or any real nature in the objects that we apprehend. They're all empty of any intrinsic existence. So if there isn't any real thing out there on its own side, in and of itself, then how can we say that what does it mean to say that we know something? What does it mean to say that one person is a reliable source of information and another is not a reliable source of information, when in fact, because everything is equally empty, there's exactly zero independent objective reality against which to judge which person is more reliable than the other. This is the philosophical problem. And this is the way Chandrakirti approaches it in his Madhyamaka Avatara. It might not be immediately obvious how this helps. I think I read these verses and translated them many times before I realized how it addresses the problem. So perceivers of conventional things, false things, are of two types: those with clear sensory faculties and those with impaired faculties. A consciousness with an impaired faculty is considered wrong in relationship to a consciousness with a good sensory faculty. And the objects of those sensory faculties, the objects known by the world and apprehended by the 6 unimpaired sensory faculties, those are true for the world. And everything else is posited as unreal for the world. Now, it doesn't seem like profoundly revealing, but the point is, he doesn't say these sense consciousnesses are right because they get at what their object really is, and these are wrong because they're mistaken about their object. He doesn't do it that way, right? And you can see that Tsongkhapa picked up on this, and he defines what it means for something to exist, not as through a process of elimination, ruling out certain things, rather than saying, oh, we can definitely get at the object itself and see what it is. We hold that something exists conventionally if a conventional consciousness is aware of it, and if no other conventional reliable cognition has so far contradicted its being as it's thus known, and if reason that accurately analyzes reality, analyzing whether something exists in and of itself, does not contradict it. And what fails to meet those criteria doesn't exist. So in other words, Tsongkhapa says for something to exist or to be knowable, you take the big sphere of everything that comes to mind, to anybody's mind, right? And then you say, okay, from within that, we're going to slice off the things that conventional reliable cognitions, on it that means minds that do not have these superficial causes of impairment, like being on LSD or so forth. And we're going to slice all those off, and then we'll get rid of also the things about claims of things that can be refuted by the analysis of how everything is empty. That's the second part. So you start with everything that everybody thinks that they know, and then you take out the things that are contradicted, right? Rather than that's how you know what you can say is real. And you can, I'm trying to show that this makes a parallel between Buddhism and science. So Karl Popper is a very famous philosopher of science, And he said, science is an evolutionary process in which hypotheses or conjectures, say about what exists, are imaginatively proposed and then tested in order to explain facts or problems. So you have all these things that we think might be there, and then you do testing and you falsify or reject certain ones, right? And then what you're left with, right, can be used to go on with and do further experimentation, thereby evolving towards better ways of doing things in the world. And yeah, and so the Dalai Lama, following along this same lines, he said, if scientific analysis were to conclusively demonstrate that certain claims in Buddhism are false, then we must accept the findings of science and abandon those claims. And there are specific examples, where he has said, for example, in Abhidharma text, there's certain statements about the distance to the moon and so forth. And he says, well, we just have to say that these cosmologies are not supported by later analysis. They may have seemed to be true at the time. So the idea is that if there isn't any absolute foundation or essential nature in things, then this is actually what allows for progress and improvement. Because, what we could reasonably take to be knowledge about the cause of disease or the movement of stars in the 15th century or the 10th century, right, is later comes to be understood to be complete fiction, right? And so things that we think we knew when we were growing up about the nature of the universe, in fact, it seems like every few years, the story about how big the universe is, how old the universe is, how many universes there are, this idea of where we are and what's going on here is an ongoing work in progress. It's unstable. There's a lack of final certainty about what constitutes knowledge. And instead of just being frustrated by this, we have to realize is that this is what makes progress possible, right? It's not a bog. It's not a quagmire that we're stuck in. We have certain beliefs that we hold. Maybe we have certain beliefs about ourselves, how we exist, or certain beliefs that we have about our partners or our relationship with our parents. And we can come to find out that some of these things were wrong or not as right as we thought they were, and then get rid of the behaviors that were associated with those ways of looking at things and refine our ways of living, refine our practice so that it better suits our situation, is more conducive to a fulfilling or meaningful life, right? So when we have a successful interaction with another living being or the environment, then this can lead us to accept that the way of thinking behind this new way of acting is actually real or true, right? And in that way, when we see, in what actually works and what doesn't work so well, right? And if we're paying attention to what works and what doesn't work so well, and we keep adapting and refining our ways of practicing medicine or astronomy or Dharma, right? Then we become more skillful in acting to promote happiness. That's the idea. So I'll just end with one example of this from the American Zen tradition. Roshi Burning Glassman from there in New York. Here he is with his dog and his cigar. Very much a modern American Zen Buddhist. He developed something called the 3 tenets. And I think that they're like a way, it's a mnemonic, there's 3 of this and 6 of that. It's a mnemonic for which my students have actually found helpful in thinking about how to approach situations. What do you say when you go to visit someone in the hospital? What do you say when you go to somebody's funeral, right? Yeah. And the 3 tenets are not knowing, bearing witness, and caring responsiveness, right? So Joan Halifax, who's a student of Bernie Glassman, she's out in Santa Fe. She's still living. Here she is with His Holiness in 2008. Fortunately, they're both still living. Joan Halifax uses the 3 tenets in training hospice workers. And this allows me to sort of flesh these out a little bit, not knowing, we can't really know exactly what's going to, people will, say, well, what would be the most helpful thing to say when somebody, has just lost their partner? It's like, well, there's no magic answer to that question. You don't know what to say, and I don't know what to say, right? And the first thing is to know that you don't magically cite, you don't have the Buddha's clairvoyance to see exactly what is going to be the right thing to say at a certain moment to a certain person, right? And when you know that you don't know, right, and you can set aside everything that you think you know, your foreknowledges, right? You open up a space for seeing what's really happening, what's present, who's in front of you. And that's called bearing witness. Seeing, with fresh eyes, with open eyes, open heart, and being fully present right there instead of being in your head and thinking about, the message of Dharma that you've brought to lay on the person, right? You really be there with the person, right? And then in that context, you respond. You can use all the tools that are available to you, your imagination, your capacity for, putting yourself in that person's shoes, your intuition that arises, your reading of body language, your intellect. You have, once you're really fully present, there's the whole of your body-mind system that's ready to sort of make the best guess it can, get the best, intuition it can about how to respond, to just listen to the person or sit with them without saying anything, or to say a mantra or whatever, right? It's different. It's not, there isn't a magic answer. You find out the answer by really being present and really paying attention in the moment. Okay. So, that's my first talk on the medical metaphor and the pragmatic approach. And I only went 8 minutes past my goal, so that leaves us 22 minutes if anybody has anything they want to say or add. Where are you all? There you are. Jeff?
Hi, Guy. How are you?
I'm well. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you again, too. So I want to go back to what you said in the very beginning, perhaps the first slide, about the importance of belonging.
Yeah.
This is more of a comment than a question, but I'm curious what your response is. I thought a lot about that because the Surgeon General of the United States just released a long report on loneliness.
I saw that. Yeah.
That it has become an epidemic, which is a term used for a very serious condition. And, so I think that the idea of belonging, which is absolutely critical, of course, for people to be healthy, I think it's in very short supply, and it's actually, been hurt a lot by how we abstract our relationships through virtual meetings, through lots of different things, staring at our phones, those kinds of things. We think of kids as doing that stuff, but it's absolutely not just kids, because wherever I go, I see, people of all ages who are doing that. So I think, and the idea of, the term quiet quitting, I think that that's also something where we're pulling back, we're pulling out of personal interactions, relationships, those kinds of things, and that it inevitably will create a sense of loneliness, which could be synonymous with not belonging. And I'm wondering how we get out of that trap. I'm older now. I just retired. I retired, so I'm not working. So I'm a senior. So there are difficulties in belonging as a senior when you don't go into work every day, that kind of thing. So it affects, people in different ways at different times, but it does seem like we're spiraling down this abstracting whirlpool to the extent where now loneliness has become epidemic, and I think it creates a lot of unhappy people.
Yeah. No, it's definitely true. I when I read that article by the surgeon, I didn't read the underlying report, but I read the op-ed or whatever it was that he wrote about it. I was like, well, this is absolutely correct. And I see it in my students. You're right. It's not just the young people, but there is a particular problem among the young people. We have us oldsters. We oldsters have have this sense that there was another way. When people actually got together in person and did things together, and there was a pre-internet age. Gosh, that's, well, that really wasn't that long ago. We all lived for a long time without the internet. And yeah, I think the people who are coming into my classes now have not lived without the internet, and their whole lives have been in the midst of, it's like an overwhelming amount of information that comes in. And I think it's really, we really need to work on helping people develop skills in terms of their relationship to technology, so that it doesn't become like something that compromises their actual relationships with other human beings, because we're going to need to have actual relationships with other human beings. So I think I don't know if I heard Dave Eggers talking on NPR yesterday, and he's like, this is a big focus of his work, moving from being a novelist into trying to use his powers in the world to do good. He's like, yeah, we have to get kids together in a room and teach them how to write and to write stories about themselves and read stories. And it's like, yeah, when they have these tutoring groups, it's not all computer based, right? Any kind of thing that we can do to build a sense of community where people can actually come together. And I had a friend who passed away just a year ago this month, and he was a great musician, and he would when we would get together for a birthday party or anything, he would start performing, and everybody would sing, and would go on for hours, literally. And it was so different because there wasn't it wasn't like we were watching a show or attending a show. We were creating our own show. Very, very, very old-fashioned, and it created a really strong sense of bonding between people to do something together, creative. That's that's all I can say. I think it is. He's the Surgeon General's right. It's a problem. Yeah.
I would just add that I don't see this trend reversing. Everyone loves to close by saying they're optimistic about human nature and those kinds of things. I don't see this trend really. I think people are more comfortable in an abstracting remote work. We were forced into it by the pandemic. And it's very, very hard to get people back into the office again because they like working in their pajamas, or because they don't have to deal with whatever it is. And I think that this tendency is just going to continue. Technology is going to make it more convenient, and I just don't see how we get out of this.
Yeah. Well, one thing is that okay, so I did all this. I mean, I taught from being past 65 and, potentially vulnerable to COVID. I was able to teach for just over a year from this basement that I'm in right now. And at first I thought, yeah, this is going pretty well. And this is certainly is convenient. It is convenient, but there's also a sense of deprivation that comes with it. And I feel like that not only did I get a sense of joy and excitement about being back in the classroom with the students, but it was palpably present among them too. I mean, it's more work to have to get up and go to class. And on the other hand, there's actually, when you have a human connection in the room, it's actually much more satisfying. That's what I mean, this is just I'm speaking not abstractly, but just from my own experience. I felt that there's convenience, but there's also deprivation. You have to be aware of what you're losing.
I understand.
Okay. Any other comments or questions?
Professor?
Yes.
When you,
Yeah.
when Smith talked about storytelling, she said that
Yeah.
the word. So
Yeah.
is that something like who was it, Campbell, who talked about the myths?
That's part of it. Yeah. I mean, that part of it was like highly condensed, right? But there's storytelling in both at the personal level and at the social level, right? So in terms that societies and cultures transmit values through narratives. As part of what I was arguing that like, for example, when I explain Buddhism to people, I'll say something like, well, an important idea in Buddhism is that we suffer needlessly because we don't see things as they are. Yeah, that's an important idea, but it's not a story. And people really want stories. And that's how, we learn and what gets inside our hearts and how we create a sense of meaning. So the life story of Buddha is not going to be displaced by a little formula or any list that we can make up, really. It's the life story itself is a profound source of the transmission of the Dharma. I was trying to just outline, the way in which that's true. And the same thing is true in, the Christian story or the think of all the stories in Judaism. So there's that kind of story. That's a source of meaning for people, right? And it's transmitted from generation to generation. At the same time, there's also the story of our lives. People can have a certain story that they tell themselves about who they are. And there's, for example, Smith talks about narrative therapy. I mean, there's ways of the therapist to help people by getting them to rethink the story that they tell about themselves and their the trauma that they've lived through. And you can tell the story in different ways, right? You can learn to reformulate your own personal story. It can be very, very healing and empowering to people. I think I'm not the expert, right? But I believe that there is empirical evidence that narrative therapy can be very effective in helping people. Just training people to think about the story of their own lives in a way different from what they've become habituated to. And then, so that's really important. I mean, I remember one time I was observing one of my professors teaching a death and dying class, and he showed the students a video of a very old man in a nursing home. And he seemed to be just kind of rambling a bit about this or that thing in his life. And then, afterwards he was explaining, well, this guy he's telling a story about his life. He's looking back on his life and making sense, that he's creating a sense of meaning for himself. This is what my life was about, retelling the story of his own life. Well, we do that not just about our lives at various points, but we do it about, the last year or yesterday, right? If somebody asks you what you did today, it's never the case that you can report all the things that happened. There's this process where we create beginning, middle, and end, right? And put together a story about what happened. That's how we make meaning out of I don't know, depending on how you want to count. You could say an infinite number of micro moments of experience that are rushing by, an uncountably vast number of experiences, that constitute our lives through a year, right? You just have to pick certain ones out and then remember them and connect them to other ones. And then that's how you create, the narrative. Everybody does this all the time. We're just relentlessly storytellers. Yeah, and that's what Joseph Campbell went beyond that to try to claim that ultimately there was only one story, which is a little bit more dubious. Oh, a hand is raised.
Professor Newland, hi, this is Suvansh.
This is Suvansh, yeah.
It's my hand. I just want to start by saying that on a tangential note, that I really appreciate you writing Introduction to Emptiness and Appearance and Reality. It's because although I have a library and I have thick books, I often go back to those. I'm relatively new to the middle way. And I go back to those to reorient myself. So thank you for writing those books. Now, as for your talk, I think what I would say is that I think there are two things. One is, very often I find that forget, people, who are far away and strangers, even people who are close to me, don't see eye to eye, and don't see. The question is, well, what's the problem? What's wrong? There is nothing wrong. When somebody cannot have a sense that there is a problem, then there's no question of going out and finding a remedy. Mm-hmm. Okay, and I find that's very common. It's like I'm amongst those who are like the outlier case, right? As in, hey, there's no problem. Okay. So stop thinking about a problem, right? Stuff happens and we keep going.
Yeah.
So that's, and I find, just life runs by, from, and it's not only people who are, my age or ahead of me, but even, I find sometimes, in youngsters, right? Children, right? Where that attitude is very common. Mm-hmm. So I thought I'll just share that. That is actually one of my struggles. Okay. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I feel, who am I? When I think like that, I say to myself, who am I to impress a view on the meaning of life on mm-hmm. anybody else?
Right. No, exactly. That's why the first sentence on my syllabus is this course is not going to teach you the meaning of life. Now, it's true that I think that people find great meaning in life through dedicating themselves to trying to be helpful to their fellow human beings using their respective skills and talents. And I think that message comes across in my class, but the students aren't forced to accept it. There's lots of different ways that they can think about things. But yeah, I think there's a lot of overlap too. That's what I'm going to try to show, is that whether you talk about Aristotle or you talk about Confucius or you talk about Jesus or you talk about Buddha, there are a lot of things that they have in common about teaching people to be more considerate of one another and treat other people seriously as subjects, as fellow human beings, rather than just tools to get what we want, right? And it is true that we have, and I think we always have had, strong elements of culture, which sort of, what do you say, are resistant to that perspective, right? And that people can be maybe feel that they're finding what they need without looking into these questions more deeply. Up to a certain point, right? But then if whatever it is they're hanging on to, that they're building their identity on, starts to slip away, like their health or their wealth or their loved ones, right? Then, yeah, they may reach a crisis point where they need to think more deeply. Yeah, this is a very good question. I think some of my students, I find it, I make my students write almost every week, and they're writing always something about the meaning of life, but related to a different thinker's perspective. But I understand their perspectives by the time I've read like 9 papers by them, and some of them do have the attitude that you're talking about. But I would say it's maybe less than a third. But the problem is that they're self-selecting. They chose to sign up for a course called The Meaning of Life. So they're more likely to be interested in thinking about the problem than the students who didn't sign up for the course. Okay. Well, I think we should wrap it up for this evening by whatever way we want to, just reflecting on dedicating whatever good has come out of this evening for ourselves to the welfare of all suffering beings. And thank all of you for showing up tonight, because like I said, it gives me an opportunity to think these things through in my mind, not just while I'm talking, but also in getting ready to give the talk too. So yeah, next week we'll focus more on kindness and the way that ideas about the cultivation of kindness and ideas about ethics, the way they show up in different cultures, as I was alluding to a moment before. Yeah. So thank you, everybody.
Thank
Yeah.
you, Professor.
Yeah. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you, Sunny. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.